No one returns from the Jaguar. It was a mistake to investigate. The past lingered in the shadows of their home like an unspoken ghost. Loss was a familiar presence, one that shaped the very fabric of their lives. The narrator's mother, hardened by tragedy, had survived more than most could bear, losing her family to the 1985 Nevado del Ruiz eruption, her first child in 1991, and her husband to violence in 1999. By then, she had already learned to accept loss as an inevitable force, something permanent and immovable. Her remaining children, the narrator and their younger sister Camilla, grew up beneath the weight of these memories. Their mother's pain became part of the air they breathed, unspoken but always there. She instilled in them a simple but unyielding truth, passed down from her own grandmother. No one returns from the Jaguar. It was a saying that, at first, felt like nothing more than an old superstition. But as time passed, the children understood its meaning. The lost never come back, and searching for them only leads to more suffering. Despite this, they lived a simple but happy life in a quiet town southeast of Bogotá. The narrator worked at a fruit stand, helping their mother, while Camilla found her passion in hairdressing. She had a natural gift for color, transforming ordinary strands into deep reds, soft blondes, or streaks of electric blue. Her clients adored her, and she dreamed of one day owning her own salon. But in the fall of 2016, Camilla disappeared. Despite their mother's strict safety measures, tracking software on their phones, daily check-ins, and a network of trusted friends, she vanished without a trace. The last signal from her phone showed her leaving Bogotá, heading east. Then, nothing. The narrator refused to accept it. They plastered Camilla's face on every street corner, in every cafe and shop window, hoping someone had seen her. They called her friends, retraced her steps, and pored over security footage in Bogotá's busiest districts. They spent sleepless nights refreshing Camilla's social media, sending desperate messages that were never read. The police treated it as just another case in a city where people disappeared all the time. They promised investigations, but the narrator could see the truth in their eyes. Camilla was just another name on a growing list. Their mother, however, did not search. She did not call the police, nor did she cry in front of anyone. She simply sat at their small wooden table, silent and still, as if she had already known this day would come. "No one returns from the Jaguar," she said, as though it explained everything. The narrator begged her to help, to believe that Camilla could still be out there. But she only shook her head, grief settling into her bones like an old friend. For months, the narrator did everything they could. They followed every lead, every whispered rumor, every grainy photograph that bore the slightest resemblance to Camilla. They called her name into empty streets, knocking on doors of people who had nothing to give them except pity. And yet, no answers came. One night, after another fruitless search, the narrator returned home to find their mother exactly as they had left her, sitting at the table, hands folded in her lap. There was no anger, no blame, just the quiet certainty that had carried her through every loss she had ever endured. "Come home," she said softly. "You cannot bring her back." But the narrator was not ready to accept that. The search continued for another year, but the weight of loss was suffocating. With every dead end, every unanswered call, the reality became harder to deny. Camilla was gone. With no answers left to chase, the narrator moved to Medellin, hoping that distance might dull the ache. They built a new life, finding work in telecommunications, learning to navigate a world without their sister's laughter. They were successful, even comfortable, but the grief never left. It sat beneath their ribs, heavy and constant, a wound that never fully closed. Their mother remained in the town where they had grown up, still tending the fruit stand, still carrying the belief that had shielded her from the worst of her pain. "No one returns from the Jaguar. The narrator wished they could believe it. It would have been easier to let go, to bury the memories in the past and move forward. But some part of them refused to. Because Camilla had been more than just another name lost to the city. She had been bright and fearless, with dreams too big for the place she had been born into. And somewhere, in the depths of Medellin's crowded streets, in the quiet hours of the night, the narrator still found themselves looking, watching for a glimpse of her in passing strangers, listening for her voice in the hum of the city. They knew the truth. They knew the odds. But they also knew something their mother never had. The unbearable, impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, the Jaguar had made a mistake. By 2023, the narrator had learned to live with loss. It had never left them, not truly, but time had dulled its edges, turning grief into something quieter, something that no longer screamed but only whispered in the back of their mind. They had spent years in Medellin, carving out a life in telecommunications. It was a job that suited them, structured, logical, built on networks and signals instead of emotions and memories. There were days when they almost convinced themselves they had moved on. Almost. But then October came, and with it, the past returned. It started as a curiosity, one of those strange technical anomalies that occasionally surfaced in their line of work. A handful of automated calls, originating from deep in a remote jungle region. At first, no one paid much attention. Automated calls were nothing new, usually tied to scams or marketing schemes. But these were different. The calls weren't selling anything. There were no robotic voices, no phishing attempts, just silence. And yet, they kept coming, bouncing from number to number, all from the same general area. Then, someone in the office made a disturbing realization. The numbers being used weren't random. They belonged to people who had gone missing over the last decade. It sent a ripple through the team. Missing persons cases weren't their domain, but this was something strange, something that didn't fit into the usual categories of fraud or error. The calls didn't follow a pattern. They weren't targeting anyone, weren't requesting anything. It was as if they existed just to remind the world that the numbers weren't forgotten. It gnawed at the narrator. Even though they had buried their search for Camilla, even though they had told themselves they had accepted reality, something inside them stirred. They hadn't opened her case file in years, hadn't searched her name online since the last time had nearly broken them. But that night, they did. They pulled out an old phone, one that still had the outdated tracking app they used when Camilla was alive. It had never worked after she disappeared. The signal had vanished along with her, leaving nothing behind. Until now. A blinking green dot appeared on the map. Camilla's phone was active, and it was in that same jungle. For the first time in years, the narrator allowed themselves to hope. They called the police, expecting urgency, expecting movement. Instead, they were met with indifference. There's no crime here, they were told. A phone pinging in the jungle doesn't mean anything. They tried to explain, tried to make them understand that these weren't just random signals, that these were phones that should have been long dead, numbers that belonged to people who had vanished without explanation. But the authorities saw no bodies, no suspects, no reason to investigate. Still, the calls continued. And soon, it wasn't just the narrator who was watching. Families of the missing started reaching out. They had heard the rumors, seen the stories online. They wanted to know, was it possible? Could their loved ones still be out there, somewhere in that endless stretch of green? The narrator became an unwilling focal point for their desperation. They received emails, phone calls, messages from mothers and brothers and friends who had lost someone they had never been able to grieve properly. Some begged for answers. Others simply wanted to know that they weren't crazy for hoping. But hope, the narrator knew, was dangerous. Their mother had always told them that what was lost, that chasing ghosts only led to more pain. No one returns from the Jaguar. And yet here they were, staring at an active signal from a phone that should have been buried. The narrator told themselves they wouldn't go, that they had learned their lesson all those years ago, when every search led to nothing but dead ends. But something in them had already made the decision. They took leave from work, packed a bag, bought a one-way ticket to the closest city to the jungle's edge. They didn't tell their mother. She wouldn't have stopped them. She wouldn't have even tried. She would have just sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, staring at them the way she had when Camilla first went missing. The look that said she already knew how this would end. The look that said, "You will not find what you are looking for." But the narrator had to see for themselves. Had to know. Because if the Jaguar had taken Camilla, then why was her voice still echoing in the dark? The signal pulsed on the screen like a heartbeat. Camilla's phone was out there, somewhere deep in the jungle, along with the eerie calls that used the numbers of the long missing. The authorities had refused to help, dismissing it as nothing more than an anomaly. But the narrator knew better. This was not just a random event, not a meaningless glitch in the system. Something was out there, something that should not be. And so, despite everything, the warnings, the lessons of their childhood, their mother's unshakable belief that the lost never return, they went anyway. The narrator had spent years avoiding the past, trying to convince themselves that some wounds could heal with time. But now, faced with the possibility that Camilla's story wasn't over, they found they couldn't turn away. If no one else would search, they would, and they wouldn't do it alone. The jungle was no place to walk into alone. Even the most experienced could be swallowed whole by its dense green walls. If the narrator was going to make it out alive, they needed help. They weren't the only one willing to risk everything. Hader was the first to join. A man whose wife, Luciana, had vanished 4 years earlier on a routine trip between villages. He had spent years chasing dead ends, but when he heard about the calls, about the numbers of the missing coming back to life, he saw what the narrator saw: a chance. Bran was older, wiry, and quiet, his eyes sharp with years of disappointment. His brother had disappeared a decade ago, swallowed by the jungle like so many others. Unlike Hader, he didn't speak of hope, only the need for answers, no matter what they were. Andres was their guide. He was local, experienced in leading tourists through the fringes of the jungle. He didn't believe in the supernatural, didn't think the missing were calling from beyond the grave. But he knew the land, and that was enough. 4 people, each carrying their own ghosts, stepping into the unknown. The deeper they went, the more the world outside faded. The jungle was alive in ways the city never was. Everywhere, it hummed, whispered, watched. They moved under a canopy that barely let the sun through, wading through mud and thick roots, hacking through vines with machetes. It rained, then stopped, then rained again, as if the sky couldn't make up its mind. Time lost its meaning. The first signs of something wrong came early: an abandoned campsite, its fire pit long cold, its tents slashed open, left to rot. Whoever had been here left in a hurry, or never left at all. A pile of plastic barrels, half buried under vines, their labels washed away by time and weather. The contents had leaked into the earth, staining the soil an unnatural shade of black. A government jeep, its metal frame stripped down to its skeleton, rusting where it had been left to die. The tires were missing, the windshield shattered, vines curling through the gaps like fingers. None of it made sense. This was not a place people lived. And yet, people had been here. Had they left? Or had something taken them? Hader was the first to notice the flowers. They weren't like anything they had seen before. Blue petals, so deeply pigmented they looked almost unnatural, glowing faintly in the dim jungle light. They weren't here before, Andres muttered, uneasy. I know these paths. These weren't here. The narrator crouched, brushing their fingers over the petals. They were waxy, smooth, but when pressed too hard, a strange red sap bled from their veins. The scent was overwhelming, sickly sweet, clinging to the air like rot masked by perfume. It made their head swim. Then, the wasps came. Red-bodied, thick-winged, moving unnaturally fast through the air. One landed on Bran's arm and he slapped it away, but the sting it left behind was deep, too deep. His skin swelled immediately, the flesh hot to the touch. "Not normal," Andres said under his breath. Nothing about this was normal. The narrator felt it then, a pressure in the air, like something just beyond sight, something just out of reach. They weren't alone. Night fell quickly in the jungle, swallowing them in darkness. They made camp near a shallow river, their only source of fresh water. The jungle whispered around them, the sounds of insects and distant calls blending into an endless hum. But something was different. The narrator couldn't sleep, not with the knowledge that they were so close to something important. So they wandered. And that was when they found it. A discarded phone, half buried in the damp soil, its screen cracked, its battery long dead. But the casing, the scratches, the faded sticker on the back, it was familiar. It was Camilla's. She had been here, and maybe, just maybe, she still was. The narrator didn't wake the others right away. Instead, they sat with the phone in their hands, staring at it in the dim glow of the fire. Their mother's voice echoed in their head. No one returns from the Jaguar. They had spent their whole life fighting against that belief. But now, sitting in the middle of a jungle that had swallowed so many people whole, they felt it creeping in, curling around their ribs. The jungle had given them a sign. But was it a trail to follow, or was it a warning? The jungle had led them here. For days, they had followed nothing but a flickering signal and the desperate hope that it might lead to something, anything, that could explain why old numbers were calling from the void, why the missing were whispering through dead circuits. Now, standing in the clearing, staring at the impossible, the narrator realized they had found something far worse than just an abandoned transmitter. This wasn't just a signal. It was a message from something that should not exist. The radio tower stood in the center of the clearing, its steel frame rusted but intact, rising above the jungle like an alien monolith. It looked wrong, not in the way of simple decay, but in something deeper, something unnatural. The air around it felt heavier, thick with something they couldn't name. And yet, the real horror wasn't the tower itself. It was what they found underneath. Andres was the first to point it out. The generator's empty. They checked the fuel tank, dry as bone. But the signal was still transmitting, the faint, ghostly hum of an active frequency buzzing in the air. Hayter moved to the antenna, running his hands over its structure. No power cables. His voice was quiet. Nothing's connected. It shouldn't be working. And yet, it was. Bran found the symbol, an axe-like mark carved into the metal casing of the tower's base, etched deep as if by something impossibly strong. It wasn't a logo, not a manufacturer's mark. It was a warning. "This isn't abandoned," Bran muttered. "Someone still comes here." A long silence followed. That was the worst part, the knowing, the understanding that they had found something they were never meant to find. The idea was simple. Move something, force a reaction. Whoever was running this would come back eventually. If they disrupted the setup, they might be able to lure them out. Bran and Hayter set to work, trying to move the generator just a few inches, just enough to make it obvious that someone had been here. The moment they pushed, it happened. A deep, wet snap. The ground beneath them shifted, soft earth giving way. And that's when they saw them. Cables. Thick, black, pulsing cables buried deep beneath the soil. They weren't electrical wires. They breathed. Hayter stumbled back, cursing. Andres grabbed a stick and jabbed at one. It didn't bend like a normal wire. It felt alive. The narrator stared at the ground in horror. This wasn't just a radio tower, it was connected to something beneath the jungle, something waiting. "We shouldn't have done that." Bran's voice was tense as they sat around the fire that night, their camp set just outside the clearing. No one argued. There was a sense of watching, as if the jungle had turned its attention to them, as if the trees were leaning closer, listening. The wasps returned, hovering just beyond the firelight, their red bodies flickering like embers. The blue flowers pulsed faintly in the undergrowth, and the signal never stopped. It was still transmitting, whispering on a dead frequency, calling out to something in the dark. They had come looking for answers. But now, as the night deepened, the narrator wondered if they had only woken something up. The jungle had never been silent. It had always whispered, through rustling leaves, through distant calls, through the shifting breath of something unseen. But that night, as the narrator lay in their tent, there was a new sound, something unnatural. It started low, a metallic groaning, the deep, slow scrape of steel dragging against steel. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the trees, it was something moving. Then came the ringing. Not a single phone. Dozens. Somewhere in the darkness, old numbers were coming back to life. Then, the screaming began. The narrator scrambled out of their tent, flashlight in hand, pulse hammering. Bran was gone. His sleeping bag lay empty, torn open as if something had dragged him from it. And then they saw him, impaled. High above them, his body was spiked through the antenna, his arms limp, his stomach split wide. His eyes moved. He was still alive. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Then, as if acknowledging their presence, the antenna shifted. It shouldn't have. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't gravity. It was alive. Hader barely had time to react before the jungle itself took him. One moment, he was there, hands shaking, reaching for his machete. The next, gone. Dragged backward into the trees, his scream cut short as something in the darkness wrapped around his throat. The narrator lunged forward, but Andres pulled them back. "You can't help him." His voice was barely a whisper. A deep clicking sound echoed through the clearing. Not an animal, not human, something else. Then the antenna moved again. But it wasn't just the antenna anymore. It rose slowly, pulling itself upright, towering over them. Not a man, not a machine. A tangle of old, active phones, dead wires, and glinting solar panels, shifting like muscle and bone. It had no face, only screens, only buttons, only the endless loop of stolen technology absorbed into something that should not be. And on its back, like a jagged fin, the antenna stood tall. It wasn't just a signal tower, it was wearing it, and it was watching them. Then the phones began to ring. All at once, the sound was overwhelming, hundreds of overlapping calls, voices rising through the jungle. Some were confused, some were angry, some were grieving. And then, one voice cut through the chaos. "Viviana." "Mama?" The narrator's breath caught in their throat. Viviana's voice, her real voice, was coming from somewhere within that thing. It wasn't just replaying old calls. It was using the lost. And somewhere, far away, their mother was hearing her daughter's voice again after all these years. Andres's phone rang. He didn't answer, didn't move. But the creature knew. The tangled mess of screens and wires turned toward him. The ringing grew louder. Andres dropped to his knees, his breath ragged. "Please," he whispered. He never got to finish. The thing moved. A blur of cables, a snap of bone. Andres's phone clattered to the ground, the call still open, his voice still caught mid-plea. Then, silence. The narrator ran, dove into their tent, heart slamming against their ribs. Outside, the creature searched. Its ringing calls hunted. Then, Viviana's voice came again, but this time she was calling them. "Come out!" Her voice was wrong, too calm, too smooth. "It has questions. It means no harm." The creature's wires twitched. Its screens blinked. "You'll never know what happened if you leave." The narrator wanted to believe, more than anything, but they knew better. With shaking hands, they pulled out their phone. Viviana was still calling. They stared at the screen, at the name they had waited so many years to see again. Then, with every ounce of strength they had left, they threw the phone into the jungle. The creature turned. The ringing followed. And in that single moment of distraction, they ran. They ran until their lungs burned, until the jungle blurred around them, until the ringing faded into the distance. They didn't stop, didn't look back, because they knew the truth now. Somewhere out there, beneath the jungle, in the pulse of dead signals and forgotten numbers, the lost were waiting, and the Jaguar had never stopped hunting. The narrator ran. The jungle blurred around them, shadows twisting, branches clawing at their skin like fingers trying to hold them back. The ringing had faded into the distance, but they knew it wasn't gone. It was still looking. Their breath burned, their legs screamed, but they didn't stop. Stopping meant death. Stopping meant the creature would find them, wrap its wires around their throat, pull them into the dark. A root caught their foot. They hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from their lungs. For a moment, everything spun. Then, somewhere behind them, the ringing returned. Closer, they clawed at the dirt, forcing themselves up, forcing their body to move, even as their vision swam. Then, a voice. "Hey, are you okay?" They stumbled forward and nearly collapsed into a group of people. Tourists, 5 or 6 of them, their bright clothes a jarring contrast to the jungle's shadowed depths. A guide stood among them, a machete on his belt, his face creased with concern. The narrator tried to speak, tried to warn them, but their throat was raw, their breath too ragged. The guide caught them before they fell. "What happened?" he asked. "What's wrong?" The narrator looked over their shoulder. The jungle was silent. Nothing followed. No ringing, no tangled wires shifting in the darkness. The thing had let them go. But they knew. It wasn't done. Not yet. They stayed with the tourists until they reached safety, a small outpost on the edge of the jungle where the real world felt unbelievably distant. The guide pressed them for details. The narrator didn't give them. Instead, they only said, "Never go looking for the missing." The guide's expression darkened. Why? The narrator swallowed hard. Because the missing were never truly gone. Because the jungle still held their voices. Because something else was using them. They didn't stay to explain. They left, walking away from the jungle, from the place where Camilla's voice had called to them, from the nightmare that had nearly taken them. But they knew they weren't really leaving it behind. Back in Medellin, the city felt unreal. The hum of traffic, the neon glow of shop signs, the chatter of normal people living normal lives. It all felt like a thin layer of paint, covering something rotting underneath. They returned to work, hoping, desperately hoping that distance would be enough. It wasn't. The calls kept coming. Before, it had been numbers from people who had gone missing years ago. Strange, silent calls from numbers that should have been long disconnected. Now, there were new numbers. Numbers that hadn't been there before. Numbers that belonged to Bran, to Hater, to Andres. The narrator stared at the screen, their breath caught in their throat. Their phone buzzed over and over, their name flashing across the screen. They didn't answer. They couldn't. But they knew. The creature was still alive, still calling, still searching, and somewhere, deep in the jungle, beneath the rusted tower and the buried wires, the lost were still waiting. The narrator thought they had escaped. They had outrun the jungle, outrun the ringing, outrun the thing that wore the voices of the dead like a mask. But the truth settled deep inside them. unshakable and cold. You don't escape the Jaguar. The creature was still out there, still calling, still waiting. The Jaguar's lesson. The Jaguar had always been a warning, a belief passed down through generations, a lesson wrapped in folklore. No one returns from the Jaguar. The narrator's mother had said it all their life. It meant what is lost is lost. It meant searching would only bring pain. They had never believed it. Not when Camilla vanished. Not when the old phone numbers started ringing. Not when they first saw the antenna shift like a living thing in the jungle's clearing. They had chased answers, and the jungle had answered back. The thing in the jungle, it was never a ghost. It was never human. It was something else, something old, something that had learned to use what people left behind. The radios, the wires, the screens, the missing. It called with their voices. It became their voices, and it lured others in. The narrator had almost fallen for it, because it knew exactly what to say. You'll never know what happened if you leave. The creature had understood their grief. It had whispered with Viviana's voice, promised them answers, baited them with the one thing they had never been able to let go of: hope. Back in Medellin, they tried to forget. They returned to work. They surrounded themselves with people. They forced themselves to believe in normalcy. But the calls kept coming. Before, the calls had belonged to the missing. Now, new numbers had joined the list. Bran, Hater, Andres. The jungle had taken them, and now it was using them. Their numbers would ring in the night, empty voices whispering from beyond the veil, waiting for someone to answer, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to follow. The final lesson? Not everything lost should be found. There are things buried in the dark, things forgotten, things meant to be left behind. The narrator had spent years searching for answers, but the jungle had only given them one truth. Some voices should remain unheard. Some things should stay buried, because once you hear the Jaguar calling, it never stops looking for you.